Morning. There it is. It's good to be back. About 80%. So COVID came and went and rampaged through our house. I think this is my third or fourth bout with it. I don't quite remember. But man, it hits like a freight ton of bricks. I was totally fine, and then 4 hours later, I had like every cold symptom that you could ever concoct in your head. At this point, the only thing I can't do is probably stand for more than 2 hours or sing. So we're doing okay, and it's good to be back. Thank you for all those who jumped in last week, last minute. Ralph got a call around 6 o'clock on Saturday, so that's a pretty good turnaround time for 6 o'clock on a Saturday. I was reading that there are efforts, and if you look this up, you can see all kinds of different sources throughout the decades and kind of all over the world. There's kind of a push, this really small subgroup of people, they're pushing to change the work week. And I'm not talking about people who are starting to do 4-day work weeks or any of that stuff, but the actual week itself. Do you know that there are suggestions that we create, instead of 7-day weeks, 8-day weeks? It'll be a 5-day week of work plus 3-day weekend. Now, the 3-day weekend part I can get behind. That would sound pretty great for any of us. Any amens for that one? But it's a weird thing to think about. We always just kind of, like 7 days of the week is what our week is. We have Monday through Sunday. We've always had that, and that's how it's always been. But there's some compelling arguments to be made as to why we shifted. As a matter of fact, if you talk to some of the social scientists who are behind this, one of the things they figured out is by doing an 8-day work week, you could actually increase both the amount of productivity and the amount of rest. Now, how that mathematically makes sense, I don't know. But somehow they've pulled it off. And so don't be surprised if within the next 10 years, maybe we start to see the 8-day week come into view. It does divide somewhat beautifully. It makes sense. It works. We could have the 8-day week. But we don't think of it that way. It's a strange thing. By the way, if you're wondering, what would the 8th day be called? Star Day. Because what else? Right? Weird day. Researchers found that it would increase the amount of working hours by about 40 hours a year, somehow, by switching this over and kind of messing with the hours of the workday and all these kinds of things. But they want to mess with the week. Now, when you hear that, it sounds unbelievably unnatural to you, right? Because 7-day work week or 7-day week is just ingrained in how our minds work. But throughout culture, it hasn't always been 7-day weeks. Different cultures have had very different ways of understanding the way we look at a week. For instance, if you look in ancient Roman culture, there were parts of Roman culture that had an 8-day week. They would have these 8 days between the market days, and that would constitute a week. There are other cultures in places like certain African tribes that would have 4-day weeks, where everything worked on a basis of 4 days. In China, for a while, in ancient China, they had 15-day weeks. I couldn't find any information about how many of those were work days versus weekends. But depending on how that shacks up, I could get behind a 15-day week. I could only do that if it was like an 8-7, right? Who wants a 7-day weekend? Like every week, right? We could get behind that. Yet here we are today, in pretty much every place in the modern world, we have 7-day weeks. And we have 52 of them, and that makes a year. Now, here's what makes this interesting. We can explain every single way of breaking down time that we have by looking at the natural order of things, except for the week. A day is marked by the rotation of the what? Not the sun, of the earth around itself. Right? Every 24 hours, the earth rotates around its own axis, and we have one day. We see that because of the way that the sun rises and sets, and the moon comes in and out, and how the planets align, and we understand how rotation works. And even if you didn't, even if you were a complete buffoon living in a cave thousands and thousands of years ago, you would notice that there is a pattern of dark and light, and then it seems to be happening at this regular interval. And so the day that we enjoy is prescribed to us by the way nature is set up to work. Right? Now, we know that God set it up that way, but nonetheless, even apart from God, you can look at the created order and you can see what a day is. Right? A month is marked roughly by the rotation of the moon around the earth. A year is the earth's rotation around the, now you can say it, Every year we travel around the sun once. If you want to know this is true, there was an experiment that they did where they set up a camera in the middle of the sky and they took a picture of the sun at the same exact time each day for a year, and it makes a pattern like this in the sky in 1 year. It literally travels like this in 1 year. You can look that up. Look up sun pictures 1 year, and you can see it's a really cool image of kind of the pattern of the sun, and that they figure out it's 1 year that it takes. And so all of the ways that we think of and conceive of time are kind of based on and visible within the natural reality of things, except for the week. There's nothing in nature that mandates or suggests a week. Whether it's 4 days or 6 days or 8 days or 15, it's this thing that doesn't seem to align with everything else. Even things like minutes and seconds make sense mathematically, right? We look at a day that has these 24 hours, and when we have these neat pockets of 60 and 60 seconds make a minute, 60 minutes make an hour, right? All of that mathematical stuff comes together beautifully, but yet the week is just this out-of-whack thing that could go either way. What is it that creates the week? The Roman Empire is responsible for really pushing the week into the mainstream. Kind of the reason I think the whole world follows the pattern of the week are the Romans, but really the Romans got it from two different places. The first is that there was a way of looking at the week in 7 days that arrived in Rome outside of the Jewish people, and that is they looked at the celestial bodies that they knew at the time and essentially just assigned 1 day to each of them. So they knew of 5 planets and the sun and the moon, which is 7, and so each day they kind of created a day to commemorate each of those, right? Because the Romans, have gods like Jupiter and Mars, and they worshiped the planets, and so it would make sense that they would create days around them. But also at the time, the Jewish people celebrated 7 days. And they did that as part of the creation pattern that God gave them. And so Rome adopted from both of those together and came up with this idea of 7 days, and then this idea of how many work days and how many rest days there would be. And here we are with the week. I'm not sure how Saturday got to be a freebie day. Somewhere in there, Saturday, maybe we just decided we were tired and we needed 2 instead of 1. And so we added Saturday as a day of rest rather than a day of work or weekend in our work calendar. But here we are. They come seemingly randomly, right? The 7-day week is not something that is prescribed by God. Right? That's something that's really important to understand. The reason we look at this, the reason we understand the week to be 7 days is not because God one day came, as we're looking at these commandments, and said, thou shalt have 7 days in a week, and a week will have happened 52 times, and that'll be your year. But it's rather something that is prescribed, not by what God says, but by what God did. Right? God spoke the world into being in 6 days, and on the 7th day he rests. The 7-day week is created after the pattern of God's own creation and resting. Right? And so this morning we're looking at the 4th commandment. We're in our series of old laws for new life. We're trying to dust off these 10 commandments that you probably learned about in Sunday school. We're trying to see how do they fit in and relate into our life today, and how do they work to create new life, right? As God is about the business of creating new life within us. And today we're looking at this 4th commandment. And we're going to answer these questions. Number 1, what is rest or Sabbath, right? The commandment to keep the Sabbath. What is Sabbath? What does it mean? What's it all about? What's the point of it? What do we mean when we say you have to keep a Sabbath? Number 2, why do we have to keep it? Why is it just not one of the old antiquated laws that doesn't fit with the way that modern society works, that should have gone away when we became an industrialized global world power that has to run things? Don't you understand that the stock market kind of runs and things are always happening and business must go on, right? Is it an antiquated thing, or why do we have to keep the Sabbath? Why is it important that we continue to pattern our life in the way that God calls us to? Why obey the 4th commandment? And then finally, number 3, once we know what it is and why we should listen to it, how do we actually go about obeying the Sabbath? This is a pretty contested topic, right? You would think it'd be a simple thing, but it's really hard to actually wrap our heads around what does it mean and how do we practically keep the the Sabbath the way that God calls us to. And so let's start this morning by looking at the passage, and we'll stand together and read. And as we go through our 10 Commandments series, this is the longest you will stand for the entirety of the 10 weeks that we look in these commandments, because it is the longest, right? So hear the words from Exodus 21. This is verses 8 through 11. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, your male servant or your female servant, or your livestock, or the sojourner who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea and all that is in them, and he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. It's the word of the Lord. Take a seat. So right off the bat, there's some things about this commandment that stand out as unique to the rest of them. The first we already alluded to. It is the longest, right? The passage, the second commandment about idolatry is the second longest. These are really the only two that have paragraphs. In a couple weeks, I'm going to have you stand and I'm going to say, thou shalt not murder, and I'm going to have you sit down again. And it's going to feel really weird. But this is a lengthy command as far as the 10 commandments go. There's a lot to unpack here. And the commandment text actually gives us allusions to answers to most of the questions that we said we were going to ask, right? So verse 8 gives us the command itself. What are we to do, right? We keep the Sabbath. We keep it holy. And then verses 9 and 10 actually tell us how we are to keep that command. There's some practical, here's what you do and how you do it. And verse 11 tells us why. And we'll get to all of those things. But we have within the command itself this structure where we learn a lot of the answers to the questions that we're seeking, right? Second unique thing, it's the only command that we have in the set of 10 commandments that actually preceded the 10 commandments itself. Right? When God in Exodus 20 says, you remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy, that's not the first time the Israelites were given that command. Right? Now, all the commands in the 10 commandments are things that the Israelites would have known. There's nothing in there that would have surprised them. They're all pretty self-explanatory things. Of course, the God who delivered them would want to be the only one. Of course, we shouldn't kill people. Of course, we shouldn't steal, right? Hopefully, when you read the 10 commandments, there's nothing there that makes you go, oh, that's a weird newbie, right? But this is the only one that actually, in direct command form, preceded the 10 commandments itself. The Israelites already had this rule and were already expected to obey it. In Exodus 16, 4 chapters prior to this, we see God's miraculous provision, right? He's rescued God's people from the hand of Egypt. They have gone through the parted waters. They have seen the Egyptian army swallowed up on the other side. And what happens is they are now on their own with God as their guide, and they start to freak out, right? It always wondered me, whenever you want to know, is a mass of people, are people smart, right? There's this phrase in the movie Men in Black where he says, well, people are smart, they'll figure it out, right? They'll get used to aliens. And the other agent says, a person is smart, people are idiots, right? Groups of people generally are smart. Are smart on their own, but collectively as a body, we're almost always dumber. It just is the way it is, right? And the Israelites are no exception. They have witnessed the miraculous deliverance of God. They come through on the other side. They watch the most powerful army in the world get obliterated. And what do? We don't have anything to eat. God? I don't think God's going to provide us food, guys. I almost wonder if it'd be better if we were just back in Egypt. Because at least, they oppressed us, killed our people, treated us like dirt under their fingernails. But at least there was food. God, there's no food here. You're not going to take care of us. They immediately start to panic. And so God puts this system in place by which he provides them food. But he doesn't just give them food the way that we would get food today. He doesn't create grocery stores with boundless supply. Instead, he sets up a system that is very similar to this notion of 6 days and 1 day. And what happens is he provides them miraculous bread, manna from heaven. And he instructs them each day that they should gather only what they need for that day. Right? Every single day, he will provide enough to feed them for that day, and no more. They shouldn't gather it. They shouldn't store it. They shouldn't try to preserve it. They shouldn't hold on to anything. They should eat their fill so that they would be provided for and satisfied, and then trust that tomorrow when they get up, the same thing is going to happen again and again and again. But then he throws them a curveball, and he says, on the sixth day, I want you to gather twice what you need for the day. Because on the seventh day, you're going to rest from gathering. I'm not going to provide any manna, and you're going to eat what you've stored up. And trust that then the next day, when it starts over, I will provide again. Let's look at Exodus 16. This is verses 22 through 26. On the sixth day, they gathered twice as much bread, 2 ohms each. And when all the leaders of the congregation came and told Moses, he said to them, this is what the Lord has commanded. Tomorrow is a day of solemn rest, a holy Sabbath to the Lord, before the 10 Commandments, right? Bake what you will bake, and boil what you will boil, and all that is left over lay aside. Lay aside to be kept till the morning. Sorry, you were ahead of me there. Now you can go. So they laid it aside till the morning, as Moses commanded them, and it did not stink, and there were no worms in it. Moses said, eat it today, for today is a Sabbath to the Lord. Today you will not find it in the fields. 6 days you shall gather it, but on the seventh day, which is the Sabbath, there will be none. Right? And so we see this command clearly coming before the 10 Commandments. It's something that was ingrained in the people of God. As a matter of fact, when God gives them this kind of way of doing things, they don't listen, and they try to gather more. And every time they gather more, God causes it to rot and worms to emerge from it so that they cannot eat it, right? And then if they don't listen and gather enough, then their struggles when it's the rest day, they seem to never be able to get it right. And we see from the very beginning one of the human conditions of lack of trust in the Lord. Right? They gather more because they don't trust that the God who has delivered them from Egypt and is raining bread from the sky will do it again tomorrow. You see the lack of faith that we have in the Lord as God's people, that they try to gather it on their own. Right? We're going to get to that a little more in a second. And so that gives us this first hint of Sabbath's origin. It comes before God makes himself a people and establishes them with the rules and regulations that are supposed to set them apart as God's people in the 10 Commandments. But it comes even before that. It's patterned after God's account of creation itself. Right? And so it's not even so much a rule as an example that God sets as a pattern in the way of life. God creates in 6 days. He does all of his work in 6 days. He makes the sea and the land and the sky and the birds and the fish and the wild land animals, and then he creates on the 6th day man in his image and calls it all very good, and then he on the 7th day rests. Right? And it's important to understand why God does this. It's not because he was tired. God didn't work and on the 7th day have more work to do that was unfinished, but said, I need a break. Here's day 7. I think sometimes we think that. God does not get tired. God does not experience tired, because tired is a human thing, and God is not human until he, in the form of Jesus, comes down in human form. God does not get tired. And so his rest on the 7th day has nothing to do with him needing a break or rest from the fatigue of all the creation of 6 days. Instead, God does it to set a pattern for how the created order was supposed to be. There would be a 7-day week, and 6 of those days would be for labor, and 1 of those days would be for rest. Right? And so the next thing to do as we look at this commandment that's worth doing is probably to define some of the terms that make it up. Verse 8 is the commandment itself. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. I don't know about you. I don't have any problems with the words remember the day and keep it. Those are all words that I understand. I don't think I have to preach on those. But Sabbath and holy are the 2 key words that we have to come to an understanding with here. Right? And so first off, Sabbath comes from the Hebrew Shabbat, which means either rest or it can also mean to cease. C-E-A-S-E. To cease from doing something, right? To cease and to rest. Interestingly, the command also tells us to keep it holy. It's not just keep the Sabbath, but keep it holy. What is the word holy? We use it to describe God all the time. We say, holy, 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 Lord God Almighty, right? Holy just means set apart. When we call God holy, what we're saying is God is not like us or this. Whatever this is, whatever the creation is, whatever we are, whatever makes us human, all of the intricacy of all those things, as grand and glorious and majestic as they are and appear to be, and as much as we have so much of the world and nature that there's yet to be discovered, the very sum total of all that the world and the universe could be, outside of that, bigger than that, greater than that, stands God, and God is holy, which means he's apart from all of that. He's not a part of the world. He is separate. He is holy. He is set apart. And so when God says to keep the Sabbath, to remember it so that we might keep it holy, what he's saying is that whatever Sabbath is, whatever it entails, however we follow it, it is something that is supposed to be entirely separate from whatever else it is that we do. Right? So there's these 6 days and whatever goes on in them, but this seventh day, this one day, this last day, this day is set apart. It is to be different. It is not to look the same as all the other days. It is supposed to be its own unique day in which we do own and unique things, and those things are Sabbath, which means in that set apart day we are to do two things, to cease and to rest. That's it. It's a day in which we cease from that which is normal for our week and our life and our pattern, and we rest from it. That's what Sabbath means. So now that we've established what it is, a day of resting, restful ceasing, separated from the normal week, let's examine the reasons why we should keep the Sabbath. Does it really matter? Right? You'll say to me, well, I have to work on Sunday. Right? What about the people that work at Target? They have to be there, right? I get frustrated every Sunday about the Sabbath in our world because I don't know about you, but Sunday is the only day where I really crave Chick-fil-A. So isn't it like you want it on Sundays? Like Friday, you drove past 6 of them somehow running errands, and you never thought that you wanted a chicken sandwich. But Sunday after church, you're driving home and you're like, waffle fries. I just want waffle fries. Right? It's frustrating. Do we still have to keep these laws? Aren't they antiquated? Isn't Chick-fil-A weird? Wouldn't it be better if they were open on a Sunday so all the Christians could go and eat there? Right? In case you can't tell, I love Chick-fil-A. I remember a couple years ago, there was all these calls to boycott Chick-fil-A, and people were panicking that they would lose all their business. And I'm like, have you had their chicken sandwiches? I don't care what your ideology is. You will eventually eat there again because they're just so good. Right? Do we keep the Sabbath? Is it important? Yes, and here is why. Number 1, and this might be obvious, but it needs to be stated. The first reason is the simplest, but the most important. We keep the Sabbath because God has commanded that we keep the Sabbath. If we trust God and we keep the other commandments of having Him as our only God and not creating idols, well, then we follow Him by listening to what He says. Right? Even if we found no convincing, compelling benefit to Sabbath keeping, even if there was no argument to be made from human form as to why it's significant or important or helpful to keep this day of rest, this set-apart Sabbath day, even if you couldn't think of any godly reason why you would do it, you still should do it for no other reason than God says to do it. So many times, I think we want to rationalize God's commands in our lives, His plans for us, His calls upon us. We want to rationalize them. And so what we do is we look at the things that God calls us to, and we put them in the boxes of feasible or not feasible by human standards. And we say, well, these are things that are beneficial that God wants me to do, so I'm going to do them, but I can't really see any benefit in doing these things, or they would hinder something that I want selfishly in my life, so I'm not going to do these things. We don't get to play God. We don't get to separate. The simple truth is God commanded it. And if we trust that God is who he says he is, then what that means is that God knows things we don't know better than we know them. And when God says, I know you, I created you, you apart from me don't know anything, I am the one who holds the keys to the universe and how everything is supposed to work and hold together, you are a feeble human with very little understanding compared to me. When he says we should rest and find our Sabbath day, then we should just do it because we trust that he knows better. The same way a child listens to a parent when it says it's time to go to sleep, even though it doesn't want to, and sees no benefit to it. Because as the parents, we know better. We know that if that kid doesn't sleep, it's going to stink for everybody. And I mean everybody. The people in the store that you go into the next day, the people next to you in the car, all the people in church when the pastor's kid hasn't slept. You know, right? It affects us. And so we obey God first and foremost simply because he commanded it. And we trust him. And we say, God, you are God and I am not. You know better. If you think that I need to have a Sabbath day set apart from the rest of my days, I'm going to do that. First and foremost, just because you say so. Because I love you and you are my God and I trust you. So we must keep it, if for no other reason, simply because God tells us in the fourth commandment, keep the Sabbath and keep it holy. Right? The second reason we keep the Sabbath is for our own health and benefit. Right? One of the things that we have to understand about God's commands as Christians is we do believe that the commands that God gives us are out of a desire for us to thrive and have the ultimate human flourishing. Right? God created us as his people. He wants us to flourish as his creation. And so we understand that the commandments he gives us aren't just these rules that we keep because he says so. Right? The phrase you hated your parents saying growing up because I said so. But that there are actually good reasons to keep those commandments. Everything that God tells us to do, he tells us to do for good reason. And in this case, we are given this commandment not just as a demand of God upon our lives, but as a gift for human flourishing, right? What God commands, he commands in order to promote human flourishing, that we might be better as people. If we believe God is infinitely good and loving, then so are his commandments, right? And if we're honest, rest is one of the lowest human virtues on the totem pole. Who here feels like they right now need some more rest? Right? Who doesn't? Right? Maybe you've slept well today. Maybe you don't need sleeping kind of rest. But man, your soul's weary with something. Right? We all need rest. We all need to take a moment from the regular weeks that we've had and just stop and breathe. And almost all of us do not do this with any kind of health or reality. We don't do it. Bill Gates was once quoted as they were asking him about why he doesn't subscribe to religion. And one of the reasons he gave is because, this is not a joke, he said, it's just not productive. Because look at Christianity, to spend a Sunday in worship, I could get so much done during that day. Christianity is just not a productive religion. That's the kind of culture that we live in. Now, few people would say it as bluntly as Bill Gates did, but we all kind of live that way, right? We don't want to rest because if we rest, there's something that's not getting done. We are a culture that values production, and we define ourselves by that which we produce. Right? How many of you, if I ask you, said, hey, tell me about yourself, the first, if not the second thing you tell me is your job? Or what, if you're retired, what your job once was? We have a tendency to define ourselves by our work, by what it is that we do or produce in this world, way quicker than we define ourselves by who or what we are, right? We don't want to get into those identity questions. Those are deep things. You don't get to talk about that with somebody you just met. But the first thing we do is, well, what do you do? What's your job? What do you produce in this world? And we define ourselves by what we produce so much that we ultimately forget to rest. Do you know in 2016, the CDC declared sleep deprivation a health pandemic in our country? Actually, pandemic level. We are a culture that sorely lacks rest, right? There's a lot amongst you who are incredibly hard workers, who work insane hours in your jobs or in places you volunteer, or whatever it is that you do with your week. You just go hard all week long, all the time, right? And here's a truth that many amongst us actually really, really need to hear, right? How many of you think about this way? Like, I have more emails in my inbox than I could ever get to in a day. I have more tasks in my to-do list than I could ever do in a week, right? And it's already Thursday, right? We live that way. Here's a hard truth that you need to hear, and I think it's one of the biggest lies that we buy into as humans. You will never, ever, ever get done with all of the work that you have to do. Ever. If we today miraculously somehow doubled the hours of work time that you have in your week, if we could magically produce an extra 40 hours out of thin air and hand those on a platter to you to say, look, now you have twice the time to get your weekly tasks done, you at the end of those 80 hours would still have work left to do. I had a really wise seminary professor who told me this truth. Whatever your job is down the road, whether it's in ministry or not in ministry, it doesn't matter what it is that you do, whatever your job is, it will take from you every single last second that you are willing to give it. It will never have enough. It will never be filled or satisfied. And you will never be done working. You will never reach the finish line. You will never come to the end of your task list, because if you come to the end of the task list that you have set yourself for the week, you will know that there are things that you could be working ahead on. And it's the greatest lie of human history. There is no such thing as being done with your work. You will not and cannot ever finish with your work. You can finish with the critical task that has to be done that minute, right? Yesterday evening, I finished writing this sermon. But then I started to think about the Monday FYI, right? And who I'm meeting with this upcoming week, and whether or not I'm prepared for all of those meetings. And I've thought through who it is that I'm seeing, and the emails that I still have to catch up on that came in this week while I was really sick, and all the, like, do you see, like, it never ends. And that's not I'm not complaining about my job. It's just the reality of anyone's job ever, anywhere. It just doesn't come to an end. It's a lie that we tell ourselves. The proverbial work finish line that we imagine being so close sometimes. If we only had 6 more hours. It doesn't exist. It does not exist. You will never produce enough to be done. And God understands that in our sinful nature, and he seeks to define us by who we are versus what we produce. And so he knows, God knows about us, that our temptation unchecked will force us to keep working on and on and on and on and on to the point where we will just collapse in exhaustion. And so God sets a limit, a time to stop and to cease and to unplug from our time of work, because he knows our minds and our bodies, and he knows that if we don't do that, we're all going to burn out. Right? Some of us in the world are lazy and don't want to work at all, but more people are at risk for overworking than underworking. And so it's important to understand that, right? So the second reason we keep the Sabbath, why it's so important, is because it's the best thing for us, and God knows that it's necessary, not just for our flourishing, but for our very survival. We have to put ourselves in a place where we keep the Sabbath, right? But there's a third reason that kind of supersedes the second. It relates, but it's far more important. And that is that God commanded rest in order to foster trust and perspective between us and him. This is what author Jen Wilkin has to say about this. It's a really great quote. More than the deliberate cessation of work for the purpose of decompressing, Sabbath is the deliberate cessation of any activity that might reinforce my belief in my own self-sufficiency. In contrast to cultural ideas of rest marked by self-care, Sabbath rest is marked by self-denial. It requires that we deny ourselves the material gain or sense of accomplishment that a day of labor brings. Our natural inclination is to believe that we are keeping the world rotating on its axis, a mindset that feeds a ceaseless work ethic. Sabbath presses on that mindset. It is not merely rest that restores, but it's rest that reorients. It reminds us that we are not God. Right? The reason we keep the Sabbath is to keep our reliance and trust in God rather than in ourselves. Right? Our instinct is to believe that we are God's, that we can keep the world going just by working harder and pushing further and going stronger and resting less, resting the minimum amount we need not to collapse. And I think that's why God introduces this command via the manna method, right? We saw when God provided manna, man immediately tries to secure the manna on his own terms. It's in our DNA to want to do it ourselves, to want to be our own little mini-gods. They were not content to allow God to be the one that rations them and keeps them fed on a steady stream and schedule. They needed to be the ones in charge of when they got to eat or not. They didn't want to say, I trust that there is a God in the universe who loves me, who cares for me, who will sustain me tomorrow. I will eat what I need, I will have nothing left, and I know that tomorrow morning there will come more. They couldn't do it. They wanted to be in charge. They wanted to store it up just in case God doesn't come through. I will have what I need by my own hand. Right? I think the manna in Exodus 16 was so that the people's eyes might be open to their own sinful tendencies, so that they might in themselves see this drive and desire to make ourselves God. And he squashes all of their hopes and dreams of being their own gods by making the food go bad when they kept it and preserving it only when they were supposed to rest and store enough for the next day, so that they would come into a pattern of trust and reliance upon him. The whole exercise creates dependence on God to act and move for our sustenance rather than dependence on ourselves. Right? The Israelites needed to learn it, and so do we. Everything about our world tells us that we're in charge of our own destiny, that we're the ones who make it happen. But God makes it happen, and Sabbath rest helps us create pedagogy for this. It helps train our hearts to develop a healthy, trusting, godly life and dependence on him. And so we keep it because he commands, we keep it because it has benefits to us, and we keep it because it restores us into a right relationship with God. When we say, I know that there's more to do, I know there's more to do, and I know that there will be consequences if it doesn't get done, but I'm going to trust you that I have worked hard and that it is enough. And I'm going to rest and spend this time focusing and reorienting my mind and my soul and my heart to you so that I can be fresh into the next week as you call me to. It teaches us and shapes us to be reliant on God, not just in this way, but in other ways. These things all work together, right? And so knowing what it is and why it's so important, how do we actually keep the Sabbath? Maybe you don't think it's realistic to keep the Sabbath in the way that God calls us to, right? I think there's two parts to this. There's the actual, what do we do? Right? What do we do? How do we keep a Sabbath? What does it mean? Like, do we get to mow our grass on Sundays or not? Is that a thing that's legal, or is that something that's frowned upon? There's like those intricate, detail-oriented, what do we actually do? And then there's the question of how do we pull it off in a world that seems to be so anti-oriented towards Sabbath. It seems to want to suck our Sundays up every single way that it can. And so the first question, we have to be careful when we command specific do's and don'ts on the Sabbath, because one of the things that will happen is Sabbath practice will become legalistic. And when things become legalistic, they tend to not be beneficial to us in the way that God has intended them to be anymore. Right? We see this in the Pharisees in the way that they approached the Sabbath. The Pharisees created all these laws around what was or wasn't lawful on the Sabbath, to the point where Pharisees had a certain amount of steps that you were allowed to take on the Sabbath before it became work and illegal. And I always wondered, what if they take more than half of those amount of steps away from their house? Like, you're either walking home like this, or you're not getting home that day. You have to stop 20 steps from your house and just stand there, or ask if your wife can drag you into the home so that you can sleep at night. They created all these extra rules, and it's really important to understand the Sabbath law is not about the intricacies of legalism, but about the spirit of achieving the things that we just talked about. And so how do we keep the Sabbath? 2 things. We stop our work. We do not work on the Sabbath. Whatever you define as work, if an activity that you're doing is definable as work to you, it's not something that should be done on the Sabbath. Now, that can mean different things for different people. Right? So, for instance, let's use cutting the grass. For some people, you hate cutting grass. Who here hates cutting grass? If someone could cut your grass for you for free, you would take them up on that offer, right? I love cutting grass. I live with 2 children. They are 5 and 2 years old. They are crazy. When I'm cutting grass, I am sitting on a tractor with headphones that can't hear them, listening to a podcast about Jesus. To me, mowing grass is one of the most restful things I can imagine in my household. It does not break the commandment or the spirit of the Sabbath for me to mow my lawn. It is the most restful thing I will do that whole weekend. Anybody else? Who are the men that love cutting grass? Give me an amen. Right? Who are the men who are nerdy about cutting their grass? Like, you have a striper, right? Anybody here make their own fertilizer, like with their own, there's some people that, I live in Hudson, there's some people that are crazy about their lawns up in there, let me tell you. Right? But it's the spirit of, is it work or is it restful? We should not be doing things on the Sabbath that are considered work. We do those things outside of the Sabbath. And the second aspect of what we ought to do on the Sabbath is to worship. It is a day to be set apart for the Lord, that we might ascribe him glory. That's why on Sundays we come and worship. And that's why if you don't come and worship as a follower of Christ, it is in part a breaking of the Sabbath commandment. It is imperative that we gather together as God's people to ascribe him worship and honor and glory and praise. That is part of what we do on the Sabbath, specifically, together, corporately, so that we might remember to do that each and every week as a part of the pattern of our lives. And so we worship and we do not work. And we have to be honest about what it means to be working. A lot of us like to kind of blur the definition of what work is. Well, Sunday is the day to get all my home chores done. Is that restful to you? And I don't mean restful in the sense that, I like to clean our house, but I don't actually like to clean our house. I just like the feeling of when it's done and I get to look at it. Right? The actual cleaning is not restful. That's work. We should not be doing things on the Sabbath that are work. That might be really hard for people to hear. In many ways, that's hard for me to hear. Because the immediate instinct that comes from myself, so just so you don't think I'm preaching to the choir here, is, well, but I have children and a job, and when else am I going to get all this stuff, right? That's the only day I have to mow the grass that I hate to mow, or to clean the house that I hate to clean, or to scrub the shower, or to meal prep, or to do whatever it is that I do, right? We shouldn't do work on the Sabbath. It's a day of rest. If you have a family, it's a day to spend time with that family that you can't spend with them while you're in your work week because you're laboring. There's no list of do's and don'ts on the Sabbath that is specifically applicable to every person, but the spirit of the law of the Sabbath is that you would find rest and worship, so that you might have a day where you have the headspace, the time, the lack of stress to be able to focus your mind on the things of Christ. How do we do this in a world where it's impossible? Well, we have to understand something really important about this commandment that we usually like to skip over, or we just don't think to go into, right? The commandment in Exodus 20, number 4, is not just a commandment to rest and keep the Sabbath day holy, right? There's way more in there. It's a commandment about how we pattern the entirety of our week, right? The fourth commandment doesn't just talk about Sunday, it talks about Monday through Sunday, right? That's why it elaborates so much. Remember the Sabbath, keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all of your work. But the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter or servant, and so forth. Within the context of the Sabbath rule is not just a command to rest on day 7, but to do all of our labor on day 1 through 6. So you think a lot of times we live lives that assume that work is somehow a result of sin and the fall. When I get to heaven, I don't have to work anymore in my job. I don't have to garden or wash dishes or go to my job that I hate to do the thing that I don't like. Labor is a part of sin, right? Like in the garden, they were just frolicking around, drinking Mai Tais and eating the fruit. And then sin happened, and all of a sudden they had to work. No. Work is a part of the original design of God's creation. Work does not equal bad. Work equals good. That's why God doesn't just say, I just kind of made the world, but then the seventh day rest. No, he says, 6 days I labored. I worked hard till I was bone tired. I did everything I could. And he calls us to that same pattern. The pattern to Sabbath rest includes 6 days of labor. And so God is commanding us in the days where we aren't to rest to be very hard at work. Very hard at work. Labor is part of the command of God. We are to labor intensely in the remaining days. God works for 6 days and rests on the seventh. And he tells us that we are supposed to do the same exact thing. And so in order to obey the command, the part of it that says rest, we have to obey the part of it that says work. And we have to create within our 6 days outside of the Sabbath a pattern of labor and work and productivity that facilitates our ability to rest on the seventh. Think about this. If you have to stay up until 11 o'clock at night to work on the weekdays so that you can have Sabbath rest, that stinks, but it's biblical. Right? If you have to stay up to get done what you have to get done, if you have to work extra hard on the other days in order to find rest on the seventh day, that's a biblical pattern. And God commands and commends that of us, to work hard, to labor intensely. The command means that we spend 6 days diligently preparing so that we might be able to obey the seventh day. Right? And part of that includes understanding our own human limitations. Right? In the work and the jobs that we have been given, we understand what I talked about earlier, the sad truth that there's always more to be done. And so we look at human capacity in an objective way, and we start to say, if I work really, really hard, what realistically can I do in my job? Right? The answer might be that the job that's being demanded of you is not realistic. And it's time for a change. Because you do live in a sinful world that will use every ounce of the time that you are able and willing to give it. And we don't live in a world that takes serious the command to obey the Sabbath. You have to live counterculturally. That might mean saying no to certain jobs. Because you know that you cannot follow a Sabbath pattern by doing that thing. Oh, that's hard. Right? But that's what it requires. In order to obey the fourth commandment, we have to understand that it's not a law about day 7. It's a law about the entirety of our life and every second of it. The fourth commandment specifically relates to our time. Right? In the first commandment, God tells us that he wants to be our only God. He wants our hearts. In the second commandment, he tells us how to worship him. He wants our methodology. In the third commandment, he talks about how he wants to be in control of what we say, our mouth, our speech, how we talk or don't talk about him. The fourth commandment is about God claiming sovereignty over all of your time and how you spend it. Not just Sundays, but every minute, in order that you might have a pattern of life that facilitates 6 days of intense, hard labor, followed by rest for your soul in him. A whole day. And he is the one who created you, and he is the one who designed and knit you together in your mother's womb and understands how you work physically, spiritually, psychologically. And it is a pattern that he sets because he knows that humans will flourish in the midst of it. It's how God designs the world to be. The commandment is all about time. How we spend it, how we manage it, how we prioritize it, what we say yes and no to according to God's plan. And trusting him, knowing that when we live this way, we follow the very pattern of God himself and do what he did, right? Who could be better? What could be better than to labor and rest as God labored and rested? I don't know about you, the world demands all kinds of things from me, but in the end, I look at it and say, if this pattern of 6 and 1 is good enough for God, the creator of the universe, then surely, as hard as it might seem to pull off, it's good enough for me too. Let's pray. Father, we thank you. Oh, this is a hard one. God, we want to be these people who produce. We want to be productive. We always want to do more and give more and earn more and secure more. We live in a world where it's never enough. We live in a world where 8 hours of labor doesn't get you what you used to. We live in a world where we have worries and deadly fears, such as if we stop, how will we feed our families? These aren't just trite things to follow because your word says it and we should just do it. These are really hard things to implement in our life because they will cause disruption. And ultimately, they will cause us to have to lean on you for our daily bread. But God, that's exactly what you call us to. You call us to live secure in you, not in ourselves. And so, God, we pray that you would be at work in the hearts and minds of each of us, that you would point us to the places where we need to change the patterns of our weeks, that we might find rest. And Lord, more than anything, we pray and we praise you that you are the God of rest and that your promise ultimately after death results in the final and ultimate rest for our souls. We praise you that you are the God that says, "Come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you. For my yoke is easy, my burden is light." You promise us that when we pattern our lives and our time after you, that you will bless that. And so hard as it is, we ask that you would, through your Spirit, enable us to make the changes we need to, that we might follow your template of hard labor and rest. And that in that time we would grow closer to you. We love you and we praise you. And all his people said,